Hey blockheads, we've got a Patreon now. We would really appreciate your support to help us keep this podcast going. There's a link in the description below, so check it out. Now on to the episode. Chirp. Hey, welcome to Creative Block. We're your hosts, Gene.
And V, we interview people in the animation industry about their life, work, and hobbies while we doodle jam.
We asked people on Twitter if they had specific topics they wanted us to discuss, as well as some drawing prompts.
And today with us, we have Chris Prynoski. Hey!
Hey!
Hi, Chris.
How's it going?
It's going. It's a nice Wednesday evening. Thanks so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
You are a legend in the animation industry.
Oh,
You
thank
are
you.
the founder of Titmouse Inc.
Whoa, you're starting to draw. Should we start drawing?
Oh yeah, let's do it. Let's jump right in.
I know.
I'll just introduce.
there-
I'll hype you up. I'll be the like Flavor Flav.
All right.
Yeah, you've done a lot. You've directed. You've created shows. You're running a studio, and so we're really excited to have you on because you have such a crazy, unique perspective on the industry, and probably have lots of stories to tell. But for those people who might not know who you are, and excluding my intro, I guess, tell us who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, I'm Chris P, and I have a studio called Titmouse. We make a bunch of cartoons. We've made a lot of stuff for Adult Swim and other places. Netflix now, I guess, probably well known for like Metalocalypse, Venture Brothers, Black Dynamite, Super Jail, China, Illinois, stuff like that. We're making I think probably something your audience would be interested in is we're making the Critical Role Vox Machina cartoon right now that was like funded by Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And we're making it for Amazon. And, basically any kind of weirdo cartoons we like making. And I kind of started the studio by accident.
Oh!
We don't know about business. We are just artists that are somehow now running a studio. That's
Explain that.
what
How do you
happens
start a studio by
sometimes.
accident?
Exactly.
Well, I moved out to LA from New York. I kind of came up on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And was like, it was an early internet boom. It was like early 2000s internet boom, and I had some friends who had started like internet, like cartoon companies. And I was like, I do cartoons for my like job, like my day job. That's my career. But I want to do something cool on the internet. What if I just like start a t-shirt company, right? And that's what I do. And I design weird, stupid t-shirts and sell them online, which was a lot harder to do like 20 years ago. All right. And then what ended up happening was I just kept getting freelance animation work, and we just ended up renting space. And, my wife Shannon, who's like, was producing commercials at the time, is like, well, I'm going to just produce your freelance work. And then that became an animation studio, even though it started as like a t-shirt company.
Interesting.
So that's kind of how it happened by accident.
Was Titmouse originally the name of that company?
Yes, that's why it has such a stupid name. And
It's iconic now.
yeah, I probably would have tried to come up with like a clever name for an animation studio, but I'm kind of glad I didn't because it's memorable.
Yes. Stands out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, look at you! You guys are you drawing a gold butt and you're drawing bow bow. Look at all the stuff you're drawing.
Taking these requests. Hey, once the requests run out, I'm out of steam. I have no idea. I'm like, I don't know. Fish. I don't know.
Chris, did you always kind of know you wanted to draw? Like, how was drawing for you when you were growing up? Was it something that you were just kind of
Yeah, I was a drawing kid. I was definitely like, I'm gonna, always liked drawing and wanted to draw. And, I had support from my folks, which is good. Like my folks actually, even though they didn't pursue it fully as a career, they were both artists in their own way, like when they were young. So they were more supportive than, parents who were like, you got to get a real job where you can make money.
Right.
So I was lucky in that respect. And I had a friend, my good friend Jack, we came up in New Jersey, and he was like a kid, his folks got divorced when we were young, and his dad was older, so his dad bought him all this shit. He had all this stuff that nobody else had as a kid, including like a video camera, which was like pretty novel, in like the mid 80s, when I was a kid. And that was like, so we'd muss around with the video camera, and at some point, like when we were in high school, he was like, hey, I got into NYU film school. I'm going to go make, try and figure out how to make films for a living. And I was like, hey, I wonder if I hadn't thought about that. I wonder if there's something in like that, like drawing and, making movies, if there could be some kind of mix, if there's some kind of meld of those things. And
Right.
animation became that thing, because before that I thought I wanted to be an architect.
I see.
But then when I was like in high school, I interned for like an architect's office, then realized like, I don't want to do that. That's more like math and
It is.
creativity. It's like only like 1% of architects in the world get to draw like the cool, like Guggenheim,
Right.
design, like a really novel, cool, like Sydney Opera House type weirdo thing.
Right.
The rest of it is like mostly like, redoing somebody's kitchen to hit their exact specs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And you have no say in it. It's like, imagine like the worst freelance job, doing like a commission for somebody of their, like, this is my original character. Draw it real ugly like this. That's what the architecture was like.
Yeah.
Such a great analogy. I
Yeah,
love
that
it.
really is.
Yeah.
I can visualize it so perfectly.
Yeah. So you were like, oh, maybe architecture, and then no, and then because you were saying that like animation didn't kind of like jump out to you right off the bat, because I guess like at the time, like how
Animation was really not as big of a thing back then. I mean, it was, for kids' cartoons and like Disney movies. Even Disney was kind of like, it was the very beginning of their like Disney Renaissance, of like, Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and stuff like that at the time. They had been in a big slump, and Simpsons was new. Like, Simpsons was basically the thing, right? It's like, oh wow, Simpsons, that's pretty cool. That's something new and different. So it wasn't really like something, it was like pre-internet, Liquid TV, I guess, that had some like, there was some like stuff on Liquid TV basically at the time, and like I'd already decided to get into animation when like, Ren and Stimpy and Nickelodeon kind of launched. So that was posted. So it really wasn't on a lot of people's radar that that's something that you could do. I don't think, at least,
Yeah, that makes sense. Because because that was like you said like, so basically, did you go to school for animation?
I did. I went to the School of Visual Arts in New York. And at the time, they didn't really have like an animation course all the way through. Like, basically you could go as an animation student, like you could say like, I want to do animation, but basically they were like, you could either take film or something called media arts when you started your first year, and then you could like start animation in your like, subsequent years. Like, they had classes, but I think I had to be like a film major and then like, just take animation classes. I don't think they had like a full-on animation course,
Right. That's interesting. And like when you went to SVA, did you imagine that you were probably gonna get into animation, or was it
Oh
still
yeah,
kind of like
definitely.
a
By then I figured it out,
Yeah.
figured out that's what I was going to do. And it all started to kind of come together with society then too. Like, I just lucked out. There was like, kind of similarly to now, there was like an animation boom that,
Yeah.
that for the time was happening. I mean, now it's like ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
It's like the amount of shows that are being made,
Yeah.
it's like unprecedented. But back then, it's like, whoa, they're making like 5 animated shows. That's more than ever. You
Yeah.
know?
It's like Gold Rush.
Now they're making like 300 or some
Yeah.
shit. It's
Wow.
crazy. I mean, good for all of the likes of us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting perspective because I feel like it sometimes feels like there's not that much, but I think that there's. I've only been in the industry for 6 years, and but I think there's so much more competition too. That
Oh yeah,
you
that's
know,
true.
it's like so. Even though there's a lot more
competition-
going on, it's like it's still hard to find a job sometimes and all this other stuff. So it's like it all scales up proportionately over time.
Yeah, it was, and it took people a lot longer to get good because you didn't have that immediate feedback
Oh, that's true.
that you have now. Like, you know, you would have to, you know, speculate on what, you know, your shot would look like. Timing, especially, is something that people are way better at younger now
Yeah.
than they used to be, because you can get immediate feedback. You're working on a timeline. You don't have to stop what you're doing and then go do a pencil test, you know, and be like, you know what, I think I better adjust this. And then eventually you just get into like pencil test fatigue.
Oh
To
god.
if you're like, you know, I've shot this enough times, good enough.
Yeah.
It's like you could just keep noodling and noodling on a timeline. Now I feel like people get better, and there's just so much more information, even to just find out the basic information on how to get, you know, just even how to do animation of any kind was so hard to find back then. It was like, you know, if you're lucky, you could figure out a way to order a book somehow, if you could even figure out how to get that information, you know.
Right.
So it just took longer to figure out how any of this shit worked.
Yeah, I think we definitely take it for granted. The whole digital revolution really like made it way more accessible. And do you feel like Titmouse came up through a time when, like, did it come up at a good time because of all the new tools that were kind of coming about? Because I always kind of feel like Titmouse was very early on to adopt the sort of flash animation kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, we were using it differently too. Like, one of the things that I saw, you know, was that it could be used to like produce full like, it was mostly being used to produce really limited animation at the time, you know. But we're like, these tools are just as good for producing full animation, and maybe we could do it more locally, because at the time it was really happening. You know, most animation was either overseas, or if it was like commercials or feature, you know, it would happen local. And I was lucky coming up in New York. I had kind of 2 parallel careers. Like, all my freelance work was like 2D, like kind of full animation on commercials, and all my TV work was like boards and then directing and, you know, eventually, you know, EPing stuff, you know. But you know, basically it was boards by day, animator by night.
Sure.
You know, and it was a good
Oh,
way
wait,
to-
you were doing
to
both
come
at the
up.
same time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so that was like my career path, but it was good. I think it improved both sides of it, you know.
Yeah.
I remember, like, even just the most general stuff of like a director saying about my boards, like, oh, it was like, seemed like a super obvious thing of like, man, I can't believe you boarded that. It was a scene, it was, you know, one of my early jobs was Beavis and Butthead, and it was like, you know, you boarded it so they have room to open the door. Nobody thinks about opening the door.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh yeah, of course, because I would have had to animate it if I was animating it. Like, a lot of people would have the closed door pose and the open door pose, and they didn't have to step back. You know, they didn't have the character step back to
That's so
make
funny.
room for opening the door.
Just little things to consider when you're doing your job.
Well, I feel like also these things now with the new tools are like easier to just kind of course correct, because you know, like, you can easily just kind of like use the camera tool in Storyboard Pro, and then boom, it's like, woo. Yeah, like, but like,
Yeah.
I feel like, because when you started doing boards, Chris, you were doing on paper.
Oh yeah, there wasn't like people didn't have computers at their desks. If you were an artist, like if you were a production person, you did, because you had your like Excel files or whatever. But basically, yeah, it was all like, it was all drawing pictures, a lot of that. And I started as a board revisionist and then ended up as a board artist. So there's a lot of, especially in revisions, a lot of that blue core tape, which is like the not as sticky tape.
Yeah.
Because you'd have to like, you draw stuff on Post-its and tape it off, because the reason you use that kind of tape is it might have to be changed back. You'd have to have the ability to peel it off and look at the pose underneath.
Damn, that's so interesting.
Another thing, another kind of lost art is something that they used to do. I don't know if this is still even a term that anybody knows, but it was called butt cutting. Have you heard butt cut?
Nope.
I've never heard butt cut.
So that was when you lay down a piece of paper on top of your panel or anything, if you're doing a layout, and you draw just the part that you need, and then you use an X-Acto knife to cut the shapes. You're cutting through both pieces of paper at the same time.
Yeah.
So that the result is there's a perfect puzzle piece for your drawing to fit into that doesn't add like another layer on top. Because that's another thing when you're doing these revisions, what you'd have to do eventually, if your panels got too thick, you'd have to like take them off and tape them on the back. And there was like a method where you had to tape them in a certain way so that like when you stacked your storyboard on top of itself, because they get pretty thick, that it didn't end up like being too weighted to one side. So you tape your old panels like on the bottom where the writing went on the back and not on the top, or else it would be too weird.
Damn, that is a whole other art form.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like actually here. So if you imagine this, right?
Yeah.
Like if you got your storyboard here, right?
Yeah.
You've got your panels, and this is your writing part underneath, right? This is generally the format that we need. If you flip this storyboard over, right? You would tape, here, I'm going to use a different color. Look at this. So imagine this is, if you could see through the paper, these are like the back of the storyboard panels on the top, right? You tape all your old panels on the bottom underneath, like that, right? Because they'd stack up. Because depending on the amount of revisions, back before digital, it's like there could be multiple passes on these boards, so that like when you like lay the boards down, right? If the front of your board panels are stacked like this, and the bottom is like this, and they fit together like little Lego pieces.
That's so funny.
I would never even think about that, but that's such a specific problem.
That is so funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you ever miss that?
Olden day
do you ever miss that, or do you like the digital renaissance?
I mean, there's no question that the digital stuff is so much better and so much more efficient. I wouldn't want to go back for like that part of it, but I do miss that you had physical pieces of art. Although I gotta say, so many of us weren't like respectful of that back in the day. Sure. I mean, when I was working on Beavis and Butthead, I can't tell you how many like original drawings of Mike Judge's that I just threw in the garbage, because it's like, this is my job, and it's like,
sure,
he gave me a note or whatever, and at the end of the week, you just like scoop all the stuff off of your desk and throw it out and start over, and I'm like, I should have kept some of that stuff.
How could you know? There's no way of knowing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. Man, I gotta start keeping drawings from my bosses. It's making me rethink some choices.
Yeah.
But that's awesome. Yeah, I think I feel like Titmouse has been such a big part of like my upbringing. Like they've worked on so much stuff. I honestly I remember because I used to do Flash animation too. That was kind of where I started. And Titmouse was like one of the first places I was applying to, because I was like, this is the studio that I want to work at. Because I just feel like Titmouse always has, and I know you foster this. It has this like sort of punk rock energy to it, and it feels very artist kind of owned and artist friendly. And I think that's really cool. I think it's great, and I think people respect it for that. And I'm curious, like, how much of that was something that was always put in early on, or is that something that you realized you kind of needed to do intentionally to create that kind of atmosphere?
Here's the thing you learn, at least, I don't know, I've learned, because it's the only way I could do it, is like, None of it's intentional. It's just the only way that I could do it.
Right.
You know, it's like we are artists. You know, we're artist run studio. We didn't come from any kind of business background or any kind of like even production background, so we didn't know. And I just came at it from an artist's point of view, and that's the way it is. So like, I wish I had some kind of cool strategy that I thought about, but it just kind of I never thought it would last this long.
Oh, really?
It just
When you
kinda happened.
what were you thinking when you
know?
started? Like when you, because well, there was like the t-shirt moment, but then there was the moment
Yeah.
when when it started, when it obviously kind of started being an animation studio. And what did you think at the
Yeah.
time? Like,
Well, there was a show. I remember like the very specific, like, moment where it's like, it was around like 2004 that it started to like. It's like, okay, we've had to rent more space. We like rented this old TV repair shop, and like this is starting to become a thing, and we just were like, my wife Shannon, you know, who was I was like EPing a show at Cartoon Network at the time, and like that was my job, right? That was like my main gig, obviously, and I was like, that's my career, you know.
what show, by the way,
And
were you?
it was called Megas XLR.
Oh, hell yeah.
Which is like about a kind of dumb guy from New Jersey who finds a giant robot from the future and just uses it to fuck around.
Very beloved show.
Yeah. So basically, Shannon was like, "Man, you gotta quit your job at Cartoon Network and focus on this." And I was like, "That's kind of nuts. Like, I can't like just quit a like EP position on a
Yeah.
like running a show at Cartoon Network. That's like, and also it's like it's how we live and make money." And she was like, "If you quit Cartoon Network and focus on this will be like your career, and this will be how you make money." So I remember being real nervous about that, but I did it and kind of set it all up, you know, so that it was, you know, like one of the directors, you know, was I bailed halfway through the second season where we'd already shipped, so it was like it was just post, and we had a real smart director, and he
Yeah.
took over the post part, and it was all copacetic with the network and stuff. Didn't burn any bridges, but man, I'm glad that she was like, you should do that, because it helped. You know, I might not have done it, and then I would have been, you know, who knows what would have happened.
Sure.
That's so
can't
cool.
know.
That's really cool. That, yeah, like having, that influence, like someone that like knows you and is like, yeah, like you should do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big leap. It's like it's
Yeah.
always scary to kind of start doing your own thing, because now there's
Yeah.
no like safety net. So that's,
Yeah.
I sympathize with that. But
Yeah.
it worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one worked out. You know, it's like, you never know. Though, you know, doesn't always work
No.
out, but that one did that time. So far,
sure.
so good. But yeah, it was just always kind of like day by day, you know. And at that time, we were doing a lot of commercials and stuff. I was directing commercials. It was like, and that was a good thing to learn on, because you could mess up a lot. You could make a lot of mistakes, and it would, you know, it wouldn't, because commercials basically had fatter budgets, right? It's
Right.
like on a TV show, they're so slim, and they haven't gotten better. Like TV budgets, like they just want them faster and cheaper, kind of.
Yeah.
You know, and it's never been better than like the late '90s. Like the situation hasn't ever gotten better. Whereas commercials, you know, they were pretty fat, and you could, especially in like the early mid 2000s, you know, they were like, they had good budgets, so you could make mistakes, and it's like, okay, well, we didn't make any money on this, but we didn't lose money, you know, and could figure out your production issues and stuff like that. I mean, probably when we were making the first season of Metalocalypse, I'm sure that show wasn't made for the budget that we had. The commercials was probably like paying all our overhead and all that stuff, you know, to give us the room to be able to you know,
Yeah.
to fuck up.
I've heard that a lot. Yeah, that it's like
Yeah.
a studio is mostly its commercial work, and then you get those more creative
Yeah.
sort of projects that keep morale up, and it's the thing that everyone kind of rallies
Yeah,
behind.
they say the old saying is one for the real, one for the meal.
Yeah, I've never heard
you
that.
do
That's great.
You do some cool jobs, right? It's like, hey, we're not going to make any money on this, but it's going to be really cool. It's worth doing. And then it's like, oh, here's this show that's like not cool. We won't put it on our reel, but it's a well-paying gig or whatever. You know?
Yeah. Has it gotten sort of easier over time to find new projects now that you have this reputation? Or because I've heard that like these days that because there's so many animated projects out there, that studios can be a little choosier, and it's more about like the networks now have to compete, or they have to kind of pitch the projects to the studio. Is that true, or is that?
Yeah, you know, it's getting definitely. I mean, we're in a very fortunate position right now, and we could turn down a lot of work.
That's great.
You know, we don't have to take everything like we used to, and we've turned down a couple of high. I can't talk about the NDA stuff, but we turned down a really high. I felt really good about turning down a really high profile job recently for like a good reason. Like it would have been like the creative is something really cool, but like just the situation behind
bad
it
vibes.
is not cool. And it was just like, you know what, we're gonna turn this one down. And they understood. I was like, we can't do this because we've got I should probably shut up because I don't want people to guess what it is. But I'm like, we got to work with artists, and you know, I want artists to be proud of our decisions that we make based on like morality and not on all based on money.
Right. Yeah. 100%.
Well, but you know, that's going back to what I was asking earlier. I think that like you're making those choices because sounds like you care about maintaining that morality, but also making sure that people are enjoying working there, so it feels like rewarding ultimately. I think that kind of answered the question I asked earlier. I think that is like a, you know.
Yeah.
It sounds like you
finally answered that.
Yeah,
one.
you answered that. Yeah, it's like you do care. You are doing it even if it's not fully conscious. You're always taking stock of like what's important for Titmouse as a studio, as a brand. I don't know if that's the right word, but you know, as an identity.
Yeah,
as an
we're
identity.
trying.
Yeah.
We're trying.
Do you feel like you guys have a brand? Like, do you actively think about it, or do you just kind of like naturally?
I think so. I mean, we don't really think about it. It's kind of just an extension of us. But
right.
I think we have a brand. We don't have as much of a house style, but I think we have
Sure.
a brand.
Yeah.
Like of just people say they can identify shows that we work on. You know, I think.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
who knows? Just a vibe or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's very very DIY. Very and I mean even like the 5-second days and everything, like there's always this sense of community, and like the, you know, all the events that Titmouse throws, like it's fostering a community, and I think that goes a long way. And even from a business end, I'm sure that like doing all that stuff is also bringing people into the orbit of the studio, so you're aware of who's in the scene, right? Like that probably helps.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Yeah, we just do stuff that we like, try to make cartoons that we like, and do stuff around the studio that we like, you know, and it's fun to, you know, hopefully we'll get into this Burbank studio soon.
Oh God,
because
hope
I think it'd be fun
How
to-
did
I was gonna ask
go
you,
ahead,
by the way, like, how was it? Because you started Titmouse in New York, right, on the East Coast?
Well, not really. I mean,
Oh,
I came up in New York, but like, and actually that was one of the things, like I made a shirt. I was making a film with a character I called Titmouse that I never finished, but I started selling t-shirts with the character on it to like raise money, and then I sold a lot of t-shirts, and I'm like, oh, this is fun. You know, this is a cool thing, and that kind of got my head in it, but it wasn't, it was like right when I moved to LA that I kind of started the company.
I see.
And we made some like little cartoons, you know, but they were mostly like promotional. At the time I was like, Flash is this cool, weird little tool. Like you can make a cartoon in a day. Like that was like the production value.
Yeah.
Yeah, really short little blobby cartoons we were making. But they're mostly to support the t-shirt. I was trying to come at it with like the opposite point of view of like, a lot of these other like webtoon places where they try to make like a real brand with like way less resources, and then they'd be stuck in that situation of like, well, now how do we merchandise it? How do we get people to think? And I was like, what if we just made cool T-shirts? And then the bonus is there's a weird cartoon based on the T-shirt, but only like one that's like 30 seconds long. And then there's not as much like weight on the cartoon having to be like, have to tell a complicated story or have a lot of,
Right.
for it to carry all the weight. The weight was with the just the design on the T-shirt, and that was fun. I can't, I think I've lost the point of.
No, but
question.
that's really cool
Went
because
off on a tangent.
I really like that way of thinking that it's like the just having fun first and then like, well, we can also make this thing to kind of support this fun thing. And that's really cool. And because for some reason I thought you started studio on the East Coast, but it's really interesting to hear that you started on the West Coast. And how is it like opening another branch, because you guys are both like on out here on the West Coast, on the East Coast, right?
Yeah, we ended up opening in New York. Our New York studio's been around, I think, probably actually 10 years now. I think it's been exactly 10 years.
Congrats.
And then we've got the Vancouver one, which is probably like 6 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, I'm guessing. It was easier to do the Vancouver one after the New York. It all happened kind of gradually and organically. With New York, I was comfortable because I'd come up in New York and I knew a lot of artists in New York and I knew the scene in New York. So it seemed natural, and there were jobs that needed to be made without studios to make them. So that was, Augenblick, they had done the first season of Super Jail.
Yeah.
And then when it got greenlit for a second season, they turned it down because they got Ugly Americans. And I called Aaron up because I went to school with him. I was a friend with him. We worked together at MTV. It was like, why did you turn this down? He's like, dude, it's so hard. It has such a low budget. We have a small studio. We can't do 2 shows at the same time. Ugly Americans has a great budget. It's not as hard. I was like, okay, I get it. And I'd known Christy. We were neighbors, Christy Krakis in Williamsburg, and worked together at MTV. We both worked on Daria and other stuff at MTV. And he was like, hey, would you make Super Jail at Titmouse? But I don't want to move to LA. And then similarly, the studio that was doing Venture Brothers was kind of falling apart. And Chris McCulloch, a.k.a. Jackson Public, is a guy I knew also from back in my school days and my New York days. And he was like, hey, would you do Venture Brothers too? So I talked to Adult Swim, and they were like, hey, whatever you want to do, if you open a studio in New York, we'll support you with work. And it just seemed like the perfect storm to do that. Like, you very rarely have that kind of opportunity where it's like, oh, you got multiple successful shows already ready to go with people that you know and a city that you know and a network that you know.
Yeah.
It was like a kind of unique opportunity, And then Vancouver, similarly, we had been working with so many Canadian animators just for quality. Not a lot of the Canadian studios, the culture was to do it for tax credits, right? But really the issue we were having at the time was it was hard in LA, like around 2010, 2011, 2012, to find like really talented 2D animators in LA, because they were they were either working on features or commercials. TV was basically shipped, or they were like people who were proficient in Flash but weren't like traditional animators, right?
Yeah.
So we found that Canada had the most of those people, and Vancouver specifically at the time. So we had been freelancing mostly for Motor City, the show that we were doing for Disney, with like maybe 15 or 20 Canadian animators on the roster, here and there. And what ended up happening was, we're like, hey, we could open a studio in Vancouver and we'd actually get a tax credit and we'd be able to put that money on the screen, It's like, rather than like using it to make the shows like cheaper, which it was like kind of like the philosophy in Vancouver at the time. That's changed, actually. I think we had a part in changing that. And then what ended up happening, it kind of lined up. We had started to go through that process, and then an animator who had worked with us for years, Gary Doodles, sold a show to Nickelodeon called Breadwinners that that basically he wanted to do it at Titmouse in LA, the animation. They were doing the pre-production at Nickelodeon, and Nickelodeon was like, I mean, it's going to be too expensive to do it at Titmouse, and they were right. You know, Doodles was like, is that true? I'm like, yeah, dude, it probably is going to be too expensive to do it in LA.
Just being real.
And, but I was like, we're opening a studio in Vancouver. We could do it there. And it just pushed us to open that studio. We got it together in like record time because we needed to, you know, to do Gary's show. And that was a great show to start on because it was really stylistic, and you know, we could employ animators of all different skill sets, you know, because there's some really full stuff and some real poppy, snappy stuff. So we had a good combo of different types of animators. It was really fun and good show, and Gary's such a fun dude to work with, and it was just so good overall. You know,
that show looks so good, and it's like it's actually pretty incredible too, like because it's all like synced to the music. It's their style, you know, this is the way Christy would board for Super Jail too. Wow.
They board to a click track, you know, to have a rhythm to it, you know?
Really?
Then the tempo of the show was kind of inherent in the way that it was like formulated, you know.
That's so interesting. Wow. Such an interesting way to think of. Totally.
Now we're doing Baby Shark
that
Doodles is running, you know, that has a similar vibe, you know, for Nick and.
Oh, he's doing Baby
Doodles
Shark. That's so cool. I heard they were making them, but I didn't know he was on it. That's so awesome.
Yeah, so it's got a vibe, you know. I'm sure whatever. Baby Shark is an incredibly successful property, but I'm sure a lot of people think like Baby Shark, you know. But this one's actually cool. You know, if you like Breadwinners, you'll probably like Baby Shark.
No,
It's got that same vibe.
Yeah,
you know?
I'm really curious. I'm excited. Like, cause exactly what you just said. I was like, well, Baby Shark, like, you know, cause we've all seen the YouTube video. It's kind of,
exactly.
It's very simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think
That's
it's
so interesting.
It's such a it's that classic thing of like, there's no such thing as luck. It's just like, you know, persistence and opportunity and preparedness for those opportunities. And it sounds like with every time Titmouse has expanded, it was a combination of like, you already had the tools available and you knew how to execute on these things and also had all these connections, which is great. And it's like, you just came prepared and you know, flexed anytime you needed to do something. And I think it's a really cool, it's cool to hear that.
Worked out in that way. Like we've never taken investment. We're still like a mom and pop shop. That way we have freedom.
That is so cool. That is
like we could just do what we want.
Yeah.
You know, that was another thing I learned by seeing friends of mine do these like flash studios in the early days of the internet. Is like some of them took investment, and then when they wanted to shut down their studios, they had no say. Like the investors are like, we're shutting you down. And they're like, can't we just keep going? And they're like, nope, we're not only selling, you know, shutting you down. We're selling everything in the studio, every desk, the refrigerators. We're going to recoup our investment.
It's all going to the bank.
Best as we can, you know.
That's something I wanted to ask about because I think there is, I hear it a lot, and I had a moment like that where a lot of artists have this romantic notion of starting a studio. And I think that it is, obviously, you know, it sounds like a fun thing. You work with all your friends and you make animation and this and that. And as somebody who especially accidentally kind of fell into it and now have been doing it for as long as you have, like, what would you say to those people who have that idea in their heads?
I mean, just do it for the right reasons. Don't do it to make money. That's for sure. It's not a good way to. I mean, you can, you know, if you get lucky like us, you can make a living out of it. But don't think, you know, that the margins on running an animation studio are a way to like get rich.
Yeah.
I'd do it I don't know. It's like, it's a weird one.
Yeah.
It's like, I tell people like, don't do it. But
I think that's good
it's
advice. I think that's
Like,
good advice.
it's like, I did it, so it's kind of like a weird thing for me to say.
Well, your situation
But
is different.
it's tough. Like, it's not a, we've stumbled into this weird, like, kind of partially creative way to still kind of be creative in it, but it's tough. It's tough. You're really pulled by the business side.
Yeah, because I was
You've
gonna ask you.
You've got to really fight that, and it's hard to not be wooed by, just that side of it. It's hard to be a pure artist, when you run a studio.
Yeah, like what's kind of like, I mean, a typical day or a typical week running a studio? Like, what is it like?
Man, it's always different. Here's the thing that I'll say, as far as like the challenges, is like the making cartoons part is the easiest part. Like, it's always people stuff, right? It's always something that's the thing. You want to make sure that the artists are happy, that the relationships are working, this or that. And there's always issues in that's been the hardest thing, to make sure that we keep that intact, that you don't become, I see how it's very easy to somehow accidentally become this like big corporate entity that you didn't mean to become.
Sure.
Right.
And we fight that all the time, just trying to avoid that, trying to make sure that doesn't happen to us, at least not fully, not to a degree that we don't want it to, if that makes sense. But there's always a different issue. I feel like now my main job is like going to meetings.
I see.
It's like I don't draw a lot.
Yeah.
When I do, it's usually like on a Post-it note, either at the beginning or end of something, where it's like, a germ of an idea, or a note, like, on a comp or something, something like really, it's rare that I'll board or do stuff like that now.
Do you miss
Like,
it, or are you kind of happy with your day to day?
I mean, it's cool. There's always cool stuff to do. I can't talk about. I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about.
Oh, you don't talk about anything you're not comfortable talking about.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I'm just no. I mean, what on the legal side, I'm allowed
I know what
to
you mean,
talk
yeah.
about. But I'm directing a feature right now.
Oh wow.
And that's a whole different thing. I'm doing some boards on that, which is fun to be able to board again on stuff. But that's a whole nother situation. And that's for what's weird is it's for a company that's not Titmouse. So we're still using some Titmouse folks on it, and we'll be doing some elements of it with Titmouse's involvement. But it was really weird to work for a company that wasn't Titmouse, because I haven't done that for so long.
That's so interesting.
I can't imagine your like daily schedule. Like, I'm like,
Yeah.
Like, hearing all of this, and I'm like, when do you sleep? When do you eat?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I get up early.
And you're a parent at that.
That's like an old man thing. It's like, get up at like 5 and then I go to sleep at like 10 o'clock at night.
Oh, I'm actually excited to hear that, because I've been trying to like figure out like how much sleep is a good amount of sleep. And like there was a moment when I was waking up at 5 a.m. but then the pandemic hit and the gym closed, and when I couldn't go to the gym, it was really, really hard for me to feel motivated at 5 a.m. But that's really cool. So you like, and from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. that's you feel like rested?
I mean, I don't know.
What does rested mean anymore?
Sorry, I just had to ask. Just a lot of coffee, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do drink a lot of coffee. That's for sure.
It's a valid response. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's tough. It's a tough juggling act, but it sounds like you enjoy all those different things. And
you gotta love it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only way it ever works in animation, right? Like people who get into it for any reason other than they love cartoons, it's just not gonna work out for them.
No.
You know, some executives fall into it, but if you're going to work in any kind of creative capacity, you got to love it. You got to want it's got to be your you know, when people ask me advice, you know, especially people coming up or considering getting into it, you know, it's like, you know, like a professional sport or something. If you don't want to do it like,
Oh yeah.
you know, 10 hours a day, every day for the rest of your life, if you don't have a passion and you can't like imagine yourself doing anything else, don't do it. You know,
Yeah.
it's like, it's got to be something you love, like you know, like if you're like trying out for the Lakers or something. It's
Yeah.
like you gotta
Yeah, I agree with that
work
a
as
lot.
hard as somebody like that works for their career. You know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like you were saying, you know, about starting a studio, just don't, because I think that if somebody isn't already ready to fight for that, then that's what they need to hear. Because
True.
I believe in the same thing with pitching ideas and trying to get a show made, you know, where people are like, well, how do you get a show made? And I'm like, I don't know. Nobody really knows. But it's like, if me saying don't even do it is enough for you to not do it, then you were never going to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wanted to ask about that too, because you've lived like 8 different lives, and you've created at least 2 shows, right?
Yeah.
And then EP'd on shows.
I've many shows that you know, because that's another thing. So many shows get sold and go into development and never see the light of day.
Yep.
So I can't even tell you how many shows I've had optioned or we've done pilots and no one's ever seen them. That's part of the industry too. And there's, at least I've gotten a couple out there. You know, there's people who are some of the most talented people I know who've created shows and have only been in development. You know, they've only done pilots, and it's a shame. You know, because that's what happens sometimes.
Sure does.
But I think you were on a point that I derailed you from.
No, that was it. Oh, I was just curious, like what that process was like for you in the past, and sort of how you feel like the industry has changed, maybe because your first show was downtown, right? Was that the first show that you sold?
You know, I actually sold. Yeah, I sold one show before that didn't go the distance, but downtown was definitely the first one to make it, and
Right.
yeah, that was like that was at a time, you know, MTV at the time. It's hard to think that it was like this, but MTV was really a cool place back then.
Sure.
It was really trying out new stuff. It was kind of like what Adult Swim ended up becoming.
Right.
You know, it had that vibe at the time, and they were willing to try weird shit. And you know, I'd pitched them that I was just gonna go wander around the Lower East Side of New York and record real people's audio, and then we're gonna like come back and like animate stories, and there wouldn't be any main characters, and it would just be this weird experiment. And they greenlit it, and then they were like, well, you gotta have some main characters, and you probably have to cast actors. But then we cast a lot of the people that we met on the street, you know, who weren't trained actors. And then we used a lot of the stories that we found when we did that like research as like the springboards for our stories and stuff. So it still had that independent vibe. The one thing that was interesting, and this is something that always happens, you know, when you're working for a client, is you know, it's definitely pushed to make it more of a comedy. Like I saw it much more of like a slice of life. Like I was inspired by like, you know, Linkletter stuff like Slacker or like Kids. I don't know if you've seen Kids, but that was like a, you know, drama 90s New York thing. And like that's what I kind of thought it would be, like this kind of weird experimental, not unfunny, but not like primarily a comedy.
Focus, yeah.
So it kind of falls, I think, somewhere in between the produced show, you know, where it's like it's kind of presented as a comedy, but it doesn't have a lot of jokes in it.
That's so funny.
But yeah, it's yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Sure.
I keep losing the point.
I just think it's so interesting that like it was like so organic and kind of like, and you could have this kind of like yeah, organic process, like just like, oh yeah, let's just record the audio in the street and then pitch this, and then
Yeah.
like the studio was like, yeah, let's do this indie project. And how were the next projects that you pitched and created different from that? Because you didn't only pitch like super indie stuff, right?
No, yeah, I've done different things throughout the years. It's funny that the show that I ended up being on Disney, that Motor City show, was one that I'd actually originally sold to MTV as an adult show.
Wow.
And that's how long ago that was. And that kind of just was sitting around, and a guy, Eric Coleman, who was heading up Nickelodeon's animation division for years, ended up leaving and going to Disney. And I'd pitched him the Motor City show as a kids, because he's like, do you have any action-y kind of stuff? He wanted action stuff that wasn't dealing with weapons, and that eventually led to Avatar, right? He's like, I want like kids action shows that aren't about like guns and shooting people, right? And Avatar was the perfect answer to that. But I pitched him the Motor City thing, and he's like, yeah, the cars thing is problematic. He's like, I don't want you to change them to kids because it'll be weird.
Yeah.
They can't drive cars, and the adults aren't going to work for Nickelodeon. So, but he remembered it when he went to Disney. He's like, hey, that would be perfect for this new Disney XD block. We just greenlit Tron. We need something to pair with that.
Right.
And yeah, and then we started doing that there. And that was one where we really tried to dig into the flash of it all, to try to use it as a tool to gain production value versus like, make it more cheap and efficient. We tried to come up with a lot of like efficiencies for how to, get the most on screen.
Yeah, that show looked amazing. That like blew my mind when that dropped.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. When I remember, because I think when like trailers came out, I just started in animation, or I was just like, it wasn't like that far after college.
Yeah.
And I was like, how can they make this show?
Yeah.
How did they pull this off?
I mean, that's one of the ways that we were, luckily Disney, Eric Coleman was really trusting. He was like, hey, I'm going to do an experiment. We're going to let you do this at your studio, because I know we can't do this inside of Disney. It's going to be impossible, right? So we ended up doing it because I, basically just wore a lot of hats, right? There was no, like, I was the creator and showrunner, but I was also like, there was no supervising director, and there was only 2 episode directors, and I was one of them. Me and Juno Lee, who's amazing. And it's like, we just tried to like stack up a lot of things. Like Antonio, who's the art director, was also, the art director on Metalocalypse. We were all just trying to like pile on and use everything we learned. And also it was kind of a show off piece. We were like, you know what? If this doesn't get greenlit for another season, this is going to be our reel for the next, bunch of years, which is exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So
That's cool,
we
though.
just put a lot of effort into it, and I think everybody worked hard on that show. We came. I mean, if you look at the credits of that show, you're going to see people from like every show in the subsequent 10 years that you are impressed by.
Yeah.
It's like we had kind of like an early all-star cast on that.
100%.
Attracting good talent. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to hear how you deal with creative block and what it feels like for you. And also,
the title of this.
The title of the show.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're clever.
Yeah, I should have had a prepared answer.
That's
for this.
okay.
I should have known that was coming.
I like to know from the gut.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is and this is probably not the most healthy way to deal with it, but I find it's good to always have more than one creative project to work on, right? And even better, if possible, for those different projects to be like in different creative disciplines, right? So that you can, when you get blocked on one project or one aspect of a project, that you could shift gears and jump onto another project. And I think like totally divorcing yourself from the creative of one project is really the only way that I find that I could do it, right? If you try to think your way through it, it hardly ever works, for me at least. It's like don't think about it at all. Think about something else. And then when you're doing something entirely different is when you'll come up with a solution, a creative solution, you know.
Yeah.
It'll come to you in a dream or, you know, while you're pooping.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
Always while you're pooping.
Yeah, exactly.
That's relatable. I feel like
I have actually had that happen in dreams before, where I've had things and I dream.
Interesting.
I dream like I'm like trying to think of a gag for a storyboard, and then I'm thinking about it a lot, and you're like kind of like reptile brain in the back of your brain,
Right.
not in the forefront. And then like I'll dream a gag, and I'll have to like get up and like sketch it out.
Yeah, you're processing it.
I wouldn't count on that, though. People listening to this podcast is a solution.
No, but it's a
something
process.
You can train yourself to do, but it happens sometimes by accident.
Yeah. Whatever happened. Yeah, things click into place after you just kind of let them rest, too.
Well, there is. Did I already talk about this on this podcast? Like, I actually read an article about how Salvador Dali did provoke ideas by trying to fall asleep. But he would hold a key in his hand that he dangled from like his armchair that he would just kind of try to fall asleep in, and then as he would start falling asleep, his hand would relax and the key would fall to the ground, which would wake him up. But that creates a new like neural pathway for ideas. So that kind of like unlocked a bunch of ideas for him. I mean, that was like I don't know, and like the dream thing that you were talking about, Chris, that kind of like reminded me of that. And I do think there's like, when we're like awake and in our day-to-day brain, it's very easy to just be like bogged down by like the reality of things. But like when we're just kind of like going on like that other reality, that's when like kind of we can open our brain to like different creative solutions, I guess.
We're getting deep on Creative Block.
I could dig it.
I just thought it was really cool. I was like, now I'm gonna tell that story every single time I can tell it.
For me, for me, it always happens in the shower because it's like a white noise, repetitive sort of habit. You know, it's like my brain turns off and I'm not bogged down by any other tasks. And then suddenly I'll have these epiphanies and I'll come up with all these solutions for things. It's like every time.
You know, it's harder these days too because of the constant distraction of our devices.
That is so true.
So it's like hard that you're ever just like sitting with yourself and your brain without some kind of like exterior influence. If you try to put your phone away and not look at it at all for a long time, then maybe you're you know, that part of you could kick in, but it's rare. It's rare these days.
Yeah.
To be entirely isolated from that.
I think what you said is great. I like about the having more than just one interest and more than one creative endeavor, and that's something that that I definitely take to heart. Like I do music as well on the side, and it helps. I think that it kind of when things are going, if things are going south in your career or whatever, because there's always going to be ups and downs. It's always nice to be able to like jump over to something else and kind of maintain control, in one or another aspect of your life when things feel like they're not there. Same thing with Creative Block, obviously. We got a bunch of good questions. We've covered a lot of them actually, just naturally.
But we might even be able to just kind of read through them, and if there's like anything that you want to add compared to what we already talked about, that could be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right on.
From @Lee Animations, Titmouse is so cool. I got 3 questions for Chris. Was it difficult to build a new animation studio and find people to work with? Is it hard maintaining an animation studio as a business? And what does Titmouse look for in animation portfolios for hire? We kind of covered the first two.
Yeah. The career one. Yeah. I mean, as far as I'll briefly touch on the other ones, which is like, we didn't try to build a studio from scratch. It happened very gradually,
Right.
and organically. And at first, it was just people I knew. It was just working with like sure bets of people I'd worked with at other studios, and it grew out of me just basically taking on too much freelance work, right? So it's like I would take on too many jobs and be like, fuck, I can't do these. How am I going to get out of this mess? I promised. It was mostly commercials.
Yeah.
Like I promised somebody that I could do this, and I'm not going to be able to finish on time. All right, I'll hire my friend to like help me finish it. And it's like eventually those friends just never stopped. It's like it ended up just being kind of permanent. So like I would say, like, if you can start in an organic way, that's the best, right? Don't grow too big too fast if you're gonna try, and it's still an issue, and especially now, the whole, like, it's a very crowded. It's crowded with jobs and not enough people there's a ton of people who are great, right? But there's so many more jobs, that it's like, it's tough. So it's like, if you try to staff a studio from scratch, it's tough these days. So what I'd say is, grow slow if you can. If you could be a slow growing studio, that's the best.
I think it's great.
That's the best advice I could give you.
Yeah.
As far as what was the third part of the question? We were like,
What does
that's the real
Titmouse look
part.
for in animation portfolio?
Oh, yeah. I mean, really, it's like, this is the most boring answer ever, but it's the most true answer ever. Drawing. It's just like drawing. It really translates to everything. If you could draw, if you can do, like life drawing, if you could do, if you have like a handle on perspective and composition and anatomy and just stupid, basic, boring drawing stuff, that's the most valuable skill. Everything else is secondary, right? A cool style and stuff like that, it's fine. There's places for that, right? But mostly, it's the fundamentals that are the things that everybody is looking for. What I'd say is, like, also less is more, right? If you're young and you don't have a lot of stuff to put on your reel, don't feel like you got to bulk it up, because the worst thing on your reel or the worst thing in your portfolio is the thing you're going to be judged on. All right. So if you've got like one like kick-ass 10-second shot and two okay shots, don't even think about putting the two other shots in. I'd rather see one cool shot, because then you're gonna, that's that. And people also, they don't have a lot of time. The people judging these portfolios might not have a lot of time to look at stuff. They might only look at the first couple pages or so, and then make their decision based on that. So I'd say keep it short. Keep it to your best stuff. If you are not a good gauge of your best stuff, get a trusted, honest friend to give you an opinion on what they think your best stuff is. So because sometimes you have a favorite thing that you're like, I love this thing that I made 5 years ago, and they're like, dude, you should really take that out of your portfolio. If you then,
For sure.
if you've got
Have a good support
somebody
system.
who can give you good advice is always helpful. What I'd say, it varies for different types of jobs, right? But there's like in drawing, right? They talk about the hand and the eye, right?
Right.
Are the things like traditional, art school stuff, right? It's like develop your hand and develop your eye, right?
Yeah.
The thing for animation specifically, and this applies to like if you're doing editing or other things that have to do with time too, is like you've got the hand, the eye, and then what I'd like to refer to as the clock, right? So if you've got a good hand, a good eye, and a good clock, the clock is like the timing part of it, right? It's like, because that's a huge part of animation too. That's one thing that you can get away with. Like if your drawing hand is not, if you're not like a super draftsman, and like in animation you don't have to be a like you have to be able to draw in any style of any show.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have like a very unique design style unless you're like, like the style that the show is based upon or something like that, right?
Right.
But for animation, if your drawing is not as strong but your timing is really, really good, you can still get work, because that's an important part of it too. If being able to sell a joke, if being able to sell acting in a scene, of whatever the point of the scene is, if it's a joke or if it's or if it's something else, if it's an action show, if it's some kind of whatever realistic fighting, or if it's a heartfelt scene, some kind of emotion, it's like being able to sell acting, comedic or otherwise, is a good skill for animators specifically, that you might not need as good of a hand or eye if you've got that clock. I mean, obviously try to develop all of those things, but
That's
don't
reminds
really good.
necessarily
Yeah,
That reminds
that's
me
really good
of
to know.
those
equal.
documentaries where you see Miyazaki like doing storyboards and he's got his clock in his hand.
Yeah. Oh yeah, when I started directing, that was the thing. I had a little stopwatch, and we would listen to the track on an audio cassette. You'd like move your arm, and you had to touch the stopwatch when you started your action and when you ended it, and you do it over and over again until you felt like, all right, I got a handle on what the timing should be on this.
Wow.
And then you put it on your X sheets and you hope for the best.
Yeah.
You don't know until 9 months later, not 9 months, but like 16 weeks later if you're sending it overseas, It's like, I hope that works, Because
Yeah.
we didn't do animatics back then,
Yeah.
You just look at the board and you imagine it in your brain. You'd imagine the timing, and then, that's what happened. And that's why I think timing on a lot of TV shows and stuff was more stiff back then, because
Right.
it was just like, how good the person who's doing that sheet timing, how good are they imagining this action, right? And it's like back in New York, the director we'd time all our own sheets. That was part of the gig. That's not the case in LA. There's a whole career you can have as a sheet timer.
Yeah, that's not really a job anymore.
It's rare. It's like
Rare.
going away. And I got to say, I'm glad it's going away. There's way better systems than
Sure.
sheets. Like, I'm not glad it's going away for the people who have those jobs,
Yeah.
but I'm glad it's going away for the industry at large, because
No, I hear you though.
fuck those people.
it's an antiquated system that
Yeah.
needs to change, and it's like,
Yeah.
we could have a way better system than that, and we
Yeah.
do. There are better systems than that. The only thing that sucks, though, right? And this is something that it's really challenging, and as a guy who has a studio, it's a thing that I think about a lot, is like the pressure that's on a board artist, and having come up from boards, I really feel this is like, you just have to. The board artist wears way more hats than they used to,
God,
in the olden days. And certainly in when I first started, there were often like layout departments on shows, and that just doesn't exist anymore. And like the amount of poses that a storyboard artist draws these days, to sell an animatic, is the kind of things that used to be handled by a sheet timer. When I was doing sheets, you draw extra poses on the sheets or on the bottom of the board, and you'd expose them on the sheets. But since that doesn't exist, that kind of falls on a board artist or sometimes a board revisionist, for such things. But and it's kind of like, it's a tough thing, because I find myself guilty, and I find a lot of board artists guilty of it too, where even if there's not the pressure to do that, there kind of is the pressure to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You always want your boards to work, and you want to sell the best possible thing, and that's the issue of this industry, right? In the because everybody loves it and wants to do such a good job, that we kind of torture ourselves and perpetuate our own sorrow in those aspects.
Yeah, I hear that. I feel like, because I'm mostly a board artist, and that's definitely something that I struggle with. I'm like, sometimes, especially if you work on a show that you love, it's like, well, I wanna make it look real cool, but then you're also thinking like, oh well, yeah, but then the union, and then all the other artists that are gonna come after me, and then.
I'm going to tell you something that'll make you laugh, right? Of the olden days of when I used to board. When I first boarded, when we would board on paper in the olden days, anybody who's currently working as a board artist will just fall out of their seat when they hear this math. All right. So the kind of like expected like going rate quota for panels, like cleaned up panels, not loose panels, but if you had to deliver like clean on model panels, 15 a day.
Oh,
Kind of what you were expected to do
Oh my god!
when you're drawing on pieces of paper.
Don't tell us this.
What the fuck happened? What
But
the
it was,
fuck happened?
it was a lot different, back then.
Well, okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
just-
It's nice to know that it was like that.
Yeah. We can.
But there was a
aspire.
lot less weight on what the boards had to deliver.
Well, yeah.
So there was a lot of support. There was a layout department that would do additional poses. There was the
man.
sheets that deliver timing and poses, and there were no animatics. So there were no. I mean, and this is going to sound like a whiny thing, but there were no executives that didn't understand how animation worked.
Yeah.
And have to see all that stuff spelled out in the board for them to be able to approve,
Right. Yeah.
something, which is kind of the case now because,
Interesting.
The way the industry works is a lot of the people who make decisions haven't necessarily gone through the process of how all this stuff works and don't appreciate, not that I don't think they're trying, it's just they don't have the experience. And, those poses are necessary for them to even understand what's happening.
Sure. Yeah, it's changed so much, and it's disappointing to hear that, but we'll see. I guess I think people need to definitely make a change and stand up for that, because board artists are doing so much more than they should be.
Yeah, I'm not an advocate for having the board artist like when you work with a track and like Storyboard Pro and like actually time stuff in the boards, I feel like that's a huge mistake.
Oh yeah.
Because the editor's job is to keep the timing of the show consistent.
Yep.
Every board artist is going to have a different
Yep.
style and a different take on it and stuff. I mean, besides the workload thing, there's just I think a creative reason not to pursue that type of
Yeah.
style. That's something we haven't really done at Titmouse because I don't think it helps,
Yeah. We've had a couple of people ask, at Nathaniel Foga and at Gunkers ask, basically, if you had the opportunity to revitalize Motor City, what are some ideas and concepts you'd have for it?
Oh, man. We wrote a good amount of a second season for that. We had we broke the whole season. We wrote even multiple scripts. For it. There was some really fun stuff. There was like a musical episode featuring the Duke of Detroit and Texas, those characters where it's kind of oh man, I wish I could remember the plot of that, but I remember digging it. There was also like a kind of like more backstory. We wanted to do, one of the things that you always run up against in shows, we had wanted to do more of the backstory in the first season of how this world came together. And there's always, with networks, or there was in the past at least, let's say, the old thinking was like, episodes should stand on their own. You shouldn't have to learn a lot about stuff up front. Streaming has kind of changed that, but my opinion was like in a sci-fi show with a brand new world, you really kind of need to know stuff about this. So there were some things that in a good way were mysterious about that thing, but also were like, what is outside of the walls of this Motor City thing? And it was going to explore more of like what happened, outside of the city. They were going to go beyond the walls and kind of figure out what had happened. You're going to learn more about how some of the main characters met and how they formed their there's some stuff that was pretty dark too that I think was probably like one of the things, because one of the things you want to do, and one of the things I always feel is good, is to have a villain who's villainous but also sympathetic in a way that you can understand why they make the choices that they do, right? I mean, that's pretty common thought process in creating villains, right? So this Abraham Cain character, the thing that we were gonna explore was kind of like his backstory and his relationship with, like, he was trying to make some kind of, like, environmentally proper thing, some kind of vehicle that didn't have to run, like with some kind of like new technology, and he was working on it. Originally it was a car, a kind of like super souped up car, right? And then you're gonna find out that this is really dark. I can understand how we probably wouldn't have gotten away with this on a Disney show.
Yeah, Disney wasn't gonna let it.
But that there was a tragic accident where, he was, to prove its safety, he and his family, his wife and his pregnant wife, like ended up getting in a horrible crash, which he was able to save the unborn child and put her in stasis, right? And then years and years and years went by, right? He eventually developed a thing, and he had been taking like anti-aging, like super future stuff, and eventually the kid was eventually born or somehow, like whatever you would call it, like, hatched from some kind of like, biomechanical thing. And Julie, one of the main characters, it would be revealed that she's like, in a weird way, considerably older than everybody else. Like Abraham, like this all happened like, 100 years ago.
Wow.
And that she was like, and it would explain why he hated cars so much, because essentially he blamed himself for like killing his wife and all this crazy stuff. But who knows? We never did it. So
Damn.
Honestly, that's really interesting that you say that, like, it's really dark, but when you kind of like watch Big Hero 6, it's kind of it's
true.
got those kind of like dark themes.
Yeah,
as well
yeah,
in it,
that's
so
true.
Who knows?
You know what? It sure does. In movies, you can get away with that stuff.
Oh,
Even in the TV show for Big Hero 6, it was based on the movie, so they got that backstory. May have been tough to sell, but who knows? Also, things change. Maybe you could do that story now.
Yeah,
At the time, the network
interesting.
wasn't.
It's been a while.
They were trying some stuff. I mean, we were lucky that they let us make that show, and that they made Tron. Those are two, and we worked on Tron a little bit. We did boards for that as well. That they were even open to doing shows like that at the time, which they quickly backpedaled on when they saw that it's like reruns of Phineas and Ferb would just do so much better ratings wise.
Sure.
Than those shows, because that's what the audience was, primed for watching. I think on streaming those shows might have done better. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think Motor City would have done really well if it had the chance to go on a streaming service.
Yep.
It has that kind of energy. We have a question from @DominicVD_Hoff. They asked if there's a place to watch the 5-second films online.
There's not like a collected place, because we'll do screenings of them.
Yeah.
I mean, here's kind of the situation. We put some like on our Vimeo page. We put some on our Instagram. They'll be shown at festivals every once in a while. And really, a lot of the artists put them on their personal pages. That's one of the things we feel strongly about, is like we for anybody who doesn't know, 5-second day is like when we let the artist like make whatever film they want, and then we screen them all at a movie theater, in a couple different cities, and we kind of let people, we kind of tell people like, don't put them on your social until after all the screenings are done, because we want it to be a pure experience for someone going to watch them at the movie theater. But then once that last screening happens, because they're not always on the same night, we can't always book a theater in every city the same night, then it's like, it's a free-for-all. It's like, do whatever you want, put it on, it's your film, put it wherever you want. So I think you can find them all over the place on people's YouTube channels or Instagrams or Twitter or whatever, defunct platforms that people don't use anymore.
Yeah.
There were probably some on Vine, at some point.
Yeah.
Whatever. So there's not really a collected place where you can see all of them as of yet.
I wanted to ask one more question from @Katie Lazo. When looking to promote a board artist to director / showrunner position, what qualities are you looking for?
That's really interesting. It's rare. It's rare that somebody makes the leap from board artist to showrunner.
Yeah, that
right?
is. Yeah,
The way that you do that is by creating and selling.
it's
your
their
own
own show.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But board artist to director
Yeah.
happens relatively. That's relatively common, right? And here's what. This is something, it's a really good question because it's not the things that you think it might be. Like, in a weird way, it's not as much about your skill as a boarder. You have to be a good boarder. Like, there's a baseline that you have to hit if you're going to become a director that has to be good. But you don't have to be necessarily the hottest board artist in town. It's much more about communication and leadership skills. Directing is getting the result on screen by working with your team, by working with your crew and working with your team members. And I've found in the past, sometimes artists, who weren't, as good at communicators as other artists, got upset when someone gets promoted ahead of them. And I would sometimes have to have that conversation with people. It's like, hey, it's not that your skill as a board artist is not the thing that's in question here. You're a great artist. It's like the team leadership stuff and getting people to rally behind you and a way to communicate and get the best work out of a crew is really the most important skill set of a director. So that's what I'd say is like work on what they say, your soft skills, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's
That
good.
makes a lot of sense.
That's good advice. And then usually we love to hear like what are your personal goals, like what, and career goals, but like what kind of stuff are you hoping to accomplish in the years to come?
Oh man, I'd love to spend more time doing personal art. Like it's easy to get sucked. I mean, this is unique to me. It's gonna sound like a high class problem, like boohoo for me, but get stuck so much into the studio and so much into the projects of the studio that rarely have time to focus on personal work. Not even necessarily like films. I mean, that could be fun too, to make little shorts and things. But also just like artwork, paintings and stuff. Like there's a couple of paintings I've been working on forever that I'm like, am I ever gonna finish this? It's like sometimes you just get bored and give up. Sometimes you pick it up, way later. You never know what's gonna happen. So yeah, more time for personal work. I think that's always worthwhile. Every once in a while, I'll get one done, but they're few and far between.
Just keep coming on the show and doodling. That's
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
there
I
you
was
go.
like,
that's the solution. That's why we're here.
like that goblin that you drew, so
gremlin,
friggin'
yeah.
cool. Yeah, it's so good.
It's like a backsheet gremlin. There's
Yeah.
a lot going on.
Bakshi was one of the first guys I worked for.
Really?
Back in the olden days. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah.
He's a real interesting character.
So I've heard. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate
Yeah, thanks for having me.
it. Your podcast, Tongue and Pencil, was definitely an influence on us starting this. So,
Oh, nice.
so thank you
Right on.
for doing that. Yeah.
Maybe I'll finish editing those one day and put the rest of them up.
I'm sure
They're all, like I was telling you guys before this started, they're like 5 or 6 years old. Yeah. We recorded them.
You do a lot. You do a lot of different things, and that's really admirable.
Yeah.
Right on.
And if you ever bring it back, you can have us on the show.
Yeah.
It'll come full circle.
Totally.
I'm just kidding. But yeah, we look forward to what you're going to do in the future, and it's been real.
Right on. Thank you. This was great. This was so much fun.
Yeah, of
Thanks
course.
for having me.
Thank you for coming on. That's the end of this creative block. Thanks to Chris for being our guest and sharing his story.
And thanks to your listeners. Follow us on Twitter. It's at Creative Block, creative without the vowels, where we ask for drawing prompts and questions to ask our guests. Huge thanks to my sister Clemens for editing the podcast.
Please subscribe to the channel if you love our content. I've been your host, Gene.
And I was V. Keep being creative, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.